Most people hit rock bottom and never find a way out. But John Reynolds wasn't like most people. His story begins not in a boardroom or a penthouse, but on a cold, rain-soaked bench in the back streets of New York City. No one knew his name. No one even noticed him. Just another homeless man lost in the noise of the city. But what they didn't know was that John was about to pull off one of the greatest comebacks in history. John didn't grow up poor. In fact, he came from a middle-class family. His father was a factory worker, and his mother stayed home to care for him and his two siblings. Life was stable until it wasn't. When John was 14, his father was laid off. The factory closed down, and the family's savings dried up almost overnight. John watched as his parents fought over money and bills. His father turned to alcohol. His mother slipped into depression. John learned to survive. At 18, he left home. College was out of the question. There was no money, and John knew it. So he took a bus to New York City with nothing but a backpack and $47 in his pocket. "I'll figure it out," he told himself. But the city didn't care. He spent his nights sleeping in shelters, when he was lucky. Other nights he curled up under overpasses or on subway benches, clutching his backpack to his chest. One night, after being kicked out of a shelter for overstaying, John sat on a park bench under a flickering streetlight. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His hands were shaking from the cold. That's when a man in a dark suit approached him. "Rough night?" the man asked. John just nodded. The man sat down next to him and handed him a paper bag with a sandwich. "No one ever makes it out," the man said. "Not unless they figure out how to play the game." Then he stood up and walked away. John stared at the sandwich, then at the business card the man had slipped into the bag. "Frank Sullivan, investment broker." John didn't sleep that night. He sat under the streetlight, staring at that card. The next day, he walked into the nearest public library and started reading everything he could find about investments, business, and finance. Day after day, he showed up at the library. He would sit for hours studying market trends, reading business journals, and taking notes on stock reports. He had no laptop, no internet, just borrowed books and sheer determination. One day, he gathered the courage to call the number on the business card. Frank Sullivan answered. "I need a job," John said. Frank laughed. "And why would I hire you?" John replied, "Because I've spent the last 6 months learning everything about the market. I know where it's heading." Frank gave him a shot as a coffee runner. John took the job without hesitation. He delivered coffee to high-powered executives and overheard conversations about deals and trades. But he didn't just listen, he learned. Every night after work, John went back to the library and studied what he'd heard that day. He connected the dots. One afternoon, he overheard 2 senior brokers discussing a stock that was about to tank. John scribbled down the details. That night, he spent hours researching the company. The next morning, he walked straight into Frank's office. "You need to pull out of that deal," John said. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You think you know more than the partners?" John handed him a detailed analysis. Frank pulled out. The company tanked 2 weeks later. The firm saved millions. Frank called John into his office. "You're not a coffee boy anymore," he said. John became a junior analyst. He started making money, real money. But he didn't stop there. He studied the market relentlessly, predicting trends with an almost unnatural accuracy. Within 2 years, he became the youngest senior analyst at the firm. Then, he started his own hedge fund. But success wasn't smooth sailing. The market crashed in 2008. John's fund took a massive hit. Investors pulled out. John faced the same choice his father had years ago: give up or fight. He fought. John secured private funding and doubled down on undervalued stocks. Within 2 years, his fund not only recovered, it exploded. By 2015, John Reynolds was worth over $1.2 billion. He owned properties in New York, London, and Tokyo. He sat on the boards of 5 major companies, but he never forgot where he came from. In 2018, John returned to the same park bench where he had once slept. He sat down under the same flickering streetlight. A young man, shivering, hungry, sat 2 benches away. John got up, walked over, and handed him a paper bag with a sandwich. Inside was a business card. John Reynolds, CEO. "Rough night?" John asked. The young man nodded. John smiled. No one ever makes it out unless they figure out how to play the game. Because success isn't about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to rise when the world pushes you down. Because sometimes the greatest comebacks start with nothing at all.